Hi everyone, welcome to our podcast. My name's Catherine.
And I'm Aubrey.
And today we're going to be diving deep into the infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer's brain on our podcast, Tea with Jeffery. Usually, whenever we talk about forensic psychology, we focus exactly what was going on in the criminal's mind and focus on what was going on mentally and biologically.
But today we're looking at things differently and we're going to focus on the social environment surrounding the case. Our main question is, how did social psychology concepts, specifically the bystander effect, implicit bias, and dehumanization, allow Jeffrey Dahmer to avoid the police for over 10 years?
This is Jeffrey Dahmer, a man who lived in a crowded apartment complex in Milwaukee.
He was the opposite of isolated, and somehow his actions were left undetected from 1978 to 1991.
If we look at this biologically,
we know he had severe personality disorders like borderline personality and schizotypal.
From a behavioral perspective, we can talk about reinforcement. The way he avoided consequences in his first offense in 1978, which made him act more careless.
But to understand how he got away with these murders for so long, we have to look at the cultural and the social side of the story.
He was born and raised in Milwaukee, where he had an education, a family of means, but he felt the neglect from his parents, which turned him to isolation, where he found his interest in animals, which ended in an evil act.
From a young age, he had an admiration of animal bones, and as he grew older, that admiration for animals turned to humans.
Jeffrey Dahmer then moved out of his parents' home and moved into an apartment by himself in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was a very divided community, especially when it came to race and money. His neighbors saw him as a quiet, isolated white guy that was living in a community that was for mostly minorities.
Social psychology looks at how people treat someone who is standoffish or isolated. Some neighbors definitely thought he was acting suspicious, but the system outside the neighborhood was influenced by the halo effect. Because Dahmer looked calm and polite, whenever people confronted him, the police just assumed he was your everyday, average white guy in a neighborhood living in minority. They saw good traits in him simply because he was quiet, well-spoken, and most importantly, had a fair complexion.
On top of that, systematic prejudice meant that people living in the neighborhood faced a lot of discrimination. When they tried to report suspicious activity coming from Dahmer's unit, authorities just brushed them off because they already had a personal bias against the neighborhood itself. Essentially, the system protected an outsider while completely ignoring the actual community members who were just trying to keep the neighborhood safe.
This leads to the bystander effect. If you look at the map of his apartment building, the units were very close together. Neighbors constantly noticed strange smells and heard loud disruptions late at night. But social psychology shows that when people are part of a large group or a crowded building, the pressure to step in actually drops. And as we can see, this here is the home of Jeffrey Dahmer. This was actual live footage filmed in 2023 after his arrest. And as we can see, he lived in a very close proximity to his neighbors, but due to the bystander effect, he went undetected from 1978 to 1991.
Since everybody thought that somebody else would probably call the landlord, or if it was an actually emergency, the police would be there to protect them, nobody ended up doing anything. And because of this, it gave Dahmer the perfect cover-up to carry out his plan.
An example of this social prejudice happened on May of 1991 when a 14-year-old boy was found by two African-American women coming out of Jeffrey's apartment completely disoriented on the street. When the two women found him, they immediately called the police, and when the officers arrived, they had to choose on who to believe. On one side, you have two distressed neighborhood residents who were deeply concerned, and on the other, you had Dahmer, who used his quiet demeanor to appear harmless and cooperative. Now, Aubrey, what would you do in this situation? Would you believe the 14-year-old boy or Jeffrey Dahmer?
I feel like if I was a police officer and a 14-year-old boy was in clear, distress, and Jeffrey Dahmer just happened to be the other guy, was trying to act normal, trying to tell the officer that was fine to get the boy back, I would obviously believe the boy. Also, the two women that were there telling the police officer that Jeffrey was in the wrong and that he always does this, I feel like there was no way that the officers should have believed Jeffrey at the time.
I completely agree. And in an instance like this, in the past, people would more so believe Jeffrey Dahmer over the 14-year-old boy just because of their skin, which is an unfortunate racial prejudice.
Implicit bias is a subconscious process in this case. The officers engaged in in-group favoritism. They felt more comfortable with Dahmer because of his quiet behavior and his fair complexion. He fit their preconceived idea of what someone who was safe would look like.
Meanwhile, they treated the worried neighborhood witnesses like an outgroup, dismissing their frantic and valid warnings because of the systematic biases against the community. The police actually helped return the minor to the apartment, showing how automatic social biases and discrimination can misguide people in authority.
Finally, we look at how Dahmer used social psychology concepts against his victims through a process called dehumanization. Dehumanization is when you're acting like the person is not human and instead is an object. Dahmer targeted individuals from marginalized groups, specifically minorities and members of the LGBTQ+ community, where they were already overlooked by society during the 80s and the 90s. Viewing his targets as objects rather than human beings with lives and families, it allowed him to bypass normal human feelings and avoid cognitive dissonance. The fact that society already marginalized these groups made his offenses culturally invisible to the public eye.
For Dahmer, this was made worse by something called the outgroup homogeneity effect. Because his victims belonged to groups that he wasn't a part of, it was way easier for him to just lump them together and ignore their individual identities, seeing them as targets instead of individuals with their own lives, families, and education.
You talked a lot about how he's targeted minority groups, but why do you think that he targeted LGBTQ+ communities when he was a part of them?
I feel like he was able to target his own community because he knew exactly where to find them. He knew exactly like their raw emotions and how to target them and exploit their feelings. And with his self-hatred, I just feel like he didn't care. And with all his personality disorders, I felt as though he was just going for whatever he could get.
When you look at case files and match them up with social psychology, it's clear that Dahmer wasn't outsmarting the world. He just worked within the gaps of human social behavior. He was protected by the implicit bias and systematic discrimination that favored him over the community's residents, and he was enabled by dehumanization.
The fact that he went undetected for so long was just as much a failure of social systems and community behaviors as it was a result of his psychological issues. If we want to prevent situations like this in the future, the lesson is that we have to pay attention to our own biases and bystander habits that let issues hide right in front of us. Thank you guys for listening to our podcast. We hope to see you next time on the Tea on Jeffery, for where we will go into other topics.
We now hope you understand how the social psychology concepts, specifically the bystander effect, implicit bias, and dehumanization, allowed Jeffrey Dahmer to avoid the police and his neighbors for over 10 years.